In 2003, a rising rock band called Iron Wolves vanished without a trace during a chartered flight over the Amazon rainforest, leaving behind only silence and unanswered questions for their families. But 20 years later, two hikers would stumble upon something in the dense jungle that would change everything they thought they knew about that tragic night. Daniel Reeves sat in his small apartment in Portland, Oregon, the familiar weight of grief pressing against his chest as he stared at the framed photograph on his coffee table. Four young men grinned back at him from the glossy image, their arms draped around each other's shoulders, sweat still glistening on their faces from what would be their final performance. His younger brother Ben stood on the far right, drumsticks raised triumphantly in the air, his infectious smile frozen in time. 20 years. 2 decades had passed since Iron Wolves' chartered plane had disappeared somewhere over the vast expanse of the Amazon basin, taking with it not just Ben, but Jake Morrison, Tyler Cross, and Matt Silva. 4 musicians on the verge of making it big, their dreams cut short by what authorities had classified as a tragic accident with no survivors. The morning light filtered through the dusty blinds of Daniel's living room, casting long shadows across the collection of memorabilia that had become his shrine to his brother's memory. Gold records that would never be claimed, magazine covers featuring the band's meteoric rise, and dozens of newspaper clippings with headlines that still made his stomach turn. Rock band missing over Amazon. Search called off after 2 weeks. Iron Wolves presumed dead. Daniel picked up his coffee mug, noting how his hands still trembled slightly whenever he thought about that phone call 20 years ago. The call that had shattered his world and left him with nothing but questions that seemed destined to remain unanswered forever. His phone buzzed against the wooden surface of the table, jarring him from his memories. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar, international number, and Daniel almost let it go to voicemail. These days he rarely answered calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Too many reporters over the years, too many conspiracy theorists and amateur investigators promising new leads that always led nowhere. But something made him pick up. "Hello? Mr. Reeves? Daniel Reeves?" The voice was accented, Spanish perhaps, with an urgency that made Daniel sit up straighter. "Yes, this is Daniel. Who is this?" "My name is Miguel Rivera. I'm calling from Brazil, from Manaus. I'm with the local authorities here." There was a pause, and Daniel could hear papers rustling in the background. "Mr. Reeves, we need to speak with you about your brother Ben and his band, Iron Wolves." Daniel's heart began to race. Over the years, he'd received similar calls that had all turned out to be false alarms, mistaken identities, or cruel hoaxes. But there was something different about this man's tone, something that made Daniel's mouth go dry. "What about them?" Daniel managed to ask. "Sir, 2 hikers found something in the rainforest 3 days ago. Something that we believe is connected to the plane crash from 2003. Miguel's voice was careful, professional, but Daniel could detect an underlying tension. "We've recovered some personal items and, well, we need you to help us identify them." Daniel closed his eyes, gripping the phone tighter. After 20 years of silence, 20 years of wondering and hoping and grieving, something had finally been found. But what, and why now? "What kind of items?" Daniel asked, though part of him was afraid to hear the answer. "Musical equipment, personal belongings, and—" Miguel hesitated. "Mr. Reeves, I think it would be better if we discuss this in person. We'd like to fly you down here to Brazil as soon as possible. The Brazilian government will cover all expenses." Daniel looked around his apartment, at the life he'd built around the absence of his brother, at the carefully maintained memorial that had become his purpose. For 20 years, he'd been frozen in time, unable to move forward because there had never been closure, never been answers, never been proof of what had really happened to Iron Wolves. Now, after 2 decades of silence, the Amazon was finally ready to give up its secrets. "I'll take the next flight out," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. As he hung up the phone, Daniel stared once more at the photograph of his brother and the band. Ben's smile seemed different now, as if it held promises of revelations yet to come. The Amazon had kept its secrets for 20 years, But something told Daniel that everything was about to change. 48 hours later, Daniel found himself stepping off a plane into the thick, humid air of Manaus, Brazil. The Amazon's largest city sprawled before him in a mixture of modern buildings and colonial architecture, all of it shimmering in the oppressive heat that seemed to wrap around him like a wet blanket. He'd never been to South America before, and the overwhelming sensory assault of sounds, smells, and sights made him feel even more disconnected from reality. Miguel Rivera was waiting for him at the arrivals gate, a tall, lean man in his 40s, with weathered features that spoke of years spent in the jungle. His handshake was firm, his English accented but clear, and his dark eyes held a gravity that immediately put Daniel on edge. "Mr. Reeves, thank you for coming so quickly," Miguel said as he led Daniel through the bustling airport. "I know this must be difficult for you, but what we've found, it's significant." As they drove through the chaotic streets of Manaus, Miguel explained his role as a liaison between local authorities and international search and rescue operations. He'd been involved in the original search for iron wolves back in 2003, though as a much younger officer at the time. "I remember your brother's case well," Miguel said, navigating around a bus belching black smoke. "We searched for 2 weeks with helicopters, ground teams, everything we had. The jungle, it's vast and unforgiving. When we found no trace after so long, we had to assume the worst." Daniel stared out the window at the urban sprawl giving way to dense green forest in the distance. "What changed? What made these hikers go where your search teams couldn't?" Miguel's jaw tightened slightly. "Technology, mostly. GPS tracking, satellite imagery, better equipment, but also luck, if you want to call it that." He glanced at Daniel. "The hikers who found the items, Rachel Stone and her guide, they weren't looking for your brother's plane. They were documenting illegal logging activities for an environmental group." The mention of illegal logging sent a chill down Daniel's spine, though he couldn't quite say why. "Where exactly did they find everything?" "About 200 kilometers. Northeast of here, deep in protected rainforest. An area that was supposed to be completely untouched." Miguel's voice carried an edge of anger. "But the loggers had been working there for months, maybe years. When they cut down a massive cecropia tree, something that had been growing for decades, they exposed what was underneath." Daniel felt his breath catch. "The crash site? We believe so. But Mr. Reeves, I need to prepare you for what we've found. It's not what we expected after 20 years. They arrived at a nondescript government building, its concrete facade weathered by decades of tropical storms. Inside, the air conditioning provided blessed relief from the heat, but Daniel's nerves were too frayed to appreciate it. Miguel led him through a maze of corridors to a conference room where a woman with short-cropped blonde hair and intense green eyes was waiting. "This is Rachel Stone," Miguel said. "She's the hiker who made the discovery." Rachel stood and extended her hand, her grip surprisingly strong. She was probably in her 30s, with the kind of lean, muscular build that spoke of years spent in challenging outdoor environments. But it was her eyes that struck Daniel most, the way they seemed to hold something back, as if she'd seen something that had shaken her deeply. "Mr. Reeves, I'm sorry for your loss," she said, her American accent surprising him. "I know this must be incredibly difficult, but I think you need to see what we found." Miguel gestured to a table covered with a white sheet. "Before we show you the items, I want you to understand something. When that tree fell, it revealed more than just wreckage. It revealed evidence that the crash site had been disturbed." "Disturbed how?" Daniel asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. Rachel exchanged a glance with Miguel before speaking. "Mr. Reeves, someone had been there before us, recently. The crash site had been carefully excavated, searched through, and then partially covered up again. Professional work, not random looters." Daniel felt the room spin slightly. "You're saying someone else found the plane? When?" "Based on the evidence, probably within the last 5 years," Miguel replied. "Whoever it was, they removed most of the larger items. What we found was what they left behind." Rachel pulled back the sheet, revealing a collection of items that made Daniel's knees weak. Ben's drumsticks, worn smooth from years of use, with his initials carved into the wood just like Daniel remembered. A water-damaged notebook filled with song lyrics in Jake Morrison's distinctive handwriting. Tyler Cross's lucky guitar pick, the one he'd claimed was made from a meteorite. And Matt Silva's silver bracelet, the one his girlfriend had given him, just before the tour. But it was the final item that made Daniel sink into the nearest chair. A digital camera, its casing cracked, but somehow still intact after 2 decades in the jungle. But it was the final item that made Daniel sink into the nearest chair. A digital camera, its casing cracked but somehow still intact after 2 decades in the jungle. "We managed to retrieve some of the images," Rachel said softly. "Mr. Reeves, I think your brother wanted someone to find this camera. I think he wanted the truth to come out." Daniel stared at the camera, his vision blurring with tears he'd thought he'd finished shedding years ago. After 20 years of silence, Ben was finally ready to tell his story. But as Daniel would soon discover, the truth about what happened to Iron Wolves was far more complicated and far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. Miguel connected the camera to a laptop, the room falling into tense silence as the device struggled to read the corrupted memory card. 20 years of humidity, heat, and jungle decay had taken their toll, but somehow, miraculously, fragments of data remained. The camera was found inside what appeared to be a makeshift shelter, Rachel explained as they waited. Not wreckage from the plane, but something built afterward. Branches, leaves, pieces of metal arranged deliberately. Someone survived the initial crash. Daniel's hands trembled as he processed this information. For 2 decades, he'd imagined his brother's death as instantaneous, merciful. The alternative, that Ben had survived only to die slowly in the jungle, was almost too horrible to contemplate. The laptop chimed softly and Miguel leaned forward. "We have something." The first image that appeared on the screen made Daniel gasp. It was Ben, unmistakably alive, his face dirty and scratched but his eyes alert. Behind him, Daniel could see the twisted wreckage of what had once been their chartered plane, its white fuselage barely recognizable among the green tangle of vines and fallen trees. "This was taken approximately 3 days after the crash," Miguel said, checking the timestamp. "Your brother was definitely alive then." Rachel pointed to something in the background of the photo. "Look at the debris pattern. The plane didn't just crash, it was torn apart. See how the pieces are scattered in that wide arc? That's not consistent with a normal crash landing." The next image showed Jake Morrison, the band's charismatic lead singer, sitting on a piece of wing debris. His left arm was clearly broken, held against his body with strips of torn fabric, but he was conscious and seemed to be speaking to whoever was taking the photo. "4 survivors, initially," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "At least 4, Miguel corrected gently. "There may have been others." The subsequent photos told a story of survival that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. The band members had clearly worked together to create shelter, gather rainwater, and tend to their injuries. Tyler Cross appeared in several images, his usually perfectly styled hair now matted with mud and blood, but his hands still moving with the precise motions of a guitarist, even without an instrument. Then the photos began to change in tone. "This is where it gets disturbing," Rachel warned, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The next image showed Matt Silva pointing toward something off-camera, his expression one of obvious fear. In the background, partially hidden by jungle foliage, Daniel could make out what appeared to be human figures watching the crash site from a distance. "Who are those people?" Daniel asked, squinting at the shadowy forms. Miguel enhanced the image as much as the old technology would. "We believe they're local inhabitants but not indigenous people. The clothing, the equipment they're carrying, it suggests something else entirely." The final clear image from the camera made Daniel's blood run cold. It showed Ben crouched behind the makeshift shelter, the camera positioned to capture what was happening beyond their camp. In the frame, 3 men in military-style clothing were approaching the crash site, assault rifles clearly visible in their hands. The timestamp read, "Day 7 after crash." "Drug runners," Miguel said grimly. "This region has been a major trafficking route for decades. The plane crash must have happened right in the middle of their territory." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her face pale. The camera was hidden, inside the shelter, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic. Ben must have known what was about to happen. He was creating evidence. Daniel stared at the image, his mind reeling. His brother hadn't died in a plane crash. He'd survived for at least a week, only to encounter something far worse than any mechanical failure or pilot error. "There's more," Miguel said quietly, his finger hovering over the mouse. "But Mr. Reeves, what comes next is going to be very difficult to see." Daniel looked up from the screen, meeting Miguel's worried gaze. "I need to know what happened to my brother. All of it." As Miguel clicked to the next image, Daniel braced himself for truths that had been buried in the Amazon rainforest for 20 years. Truths that someone had recently tried very hard to keep hidden. The next image was blurry, clearly taken in haste, but the scene it captured was unmistakable. Armed men were surrounding the makeshift camp, while the band members knelt on the ground, their hands visible above their heads in surrender. Daniel could see his brother Ben in the foreground, still clutching the camera's remote timer, his face a mask of determination, even in what were clearly his final moments of freedom. "This appears to be the last photo Ben took himself," Miguel said softly. "The remaining images were taken by someone else." Rachel reached across the table and squeezed Daniel's shoulder. "Are you sure you want to continue? What comes next?" "I have to," Daniel interrupted, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. They deserve to have their story told. The subsequent photos were clearly taken by one of the armed men, documenting what appeared to be an interrogation. The band members were separated, each tied to different trees around the camp perimeter. Daniel could see his brother's drum calluses even in the poor image quality. Those familiar hands that had spent countless hours creating music now bound with crude rope. "They were looking for something," Miguel observed, pointing to images that showed the armed men systematically searching through the plane wreckage. This wasn't random violence. They needed information. In one particularly clear photo, Daniel could see Jake Morrison's mouth moving, obviously speaking to his captors. His broken arm hung at an unnatural angle, but his expression remained defiant. Tyler Cross was visible in the background, his guitarist's fingers working frantically at his bonds. "The plane," Rachel said suddenly, studying the images more closely. "Look at how thoroughly they're searching it. They're not looking for valuables or equipment. They're looking for something specific." Miguel nodded grimly. "We believe the plane may have been carrying more than just passengers when it went down. The flight manifest shows some inconsistencies, cargo that was registered but never properly documented." Daniel looked up sharply. "What kind of cargo?" "That's what we're trying to determine. But drug trafficking operations in this region often use chartered flights to move product. Your brother's band may have unknowingly been passengers on a smuggling's run." The implications hit Daniel like a physical blow. Iron Wolves had been legitimate musicians, clean-living young men pursuing their dreams. The idea that they'd been unwittingly caught up in drug trafficking was almost as devastating as their deaths. "The pilot," Daniel said suddenly. "Carlos Mendoza. Did you ever find his body?" Miguel and Rachel exchanged a meaningful glance. "Mr. Reeves, there's something else we need to tell you about Captain Mendoza." Rachel pulled out a tablet and showed Daniel a news article from 2001, 2 years before the crash. The headline read, "Pilot arrested in Colombia drug bust, released on technicality." Carlos Mendoza had been suspected of running drugs for years, Miguel explained. He was arrested in Bogotá with 50 kilograms of cocaine in his aircraft, but the charges were dropped due to procedural errors. He disappeared for months afterward, then resurfaced with a clean record and a new charter business. Daniel studied the pilot's photograph. Mendoza looked like any other charter pilot, middle-aged and unremarkable, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years flying small planes over dangerous terrain. But now Daniel was seeing him through different eyes. "You think the band was set up?" Daniel asked. "We think they were in the wrong place at the wrong time," Rachel replied. "Mendoza was probably running drugs when the plane went down. The people who captured your brother and his friends were protecting their investment." The final images from the camera showed the band members being led away from the crash site at gunpoint, disappearing into the green maze of the Amazon rainforest. Ben was the last to leave, turning back once to look at the camera he'd hidden, his expression a mixture of hope and resignation. It was the last anyone would see of iron wolves alive. "Mr. Reeves," Miguel said gently, "we need to ask you something important. In the weeks before your brother's trip to South America, did he mention anything unusual about their travel arrangements? Anything about the pilot or the plane?" Daniel closed his eyes, trying to remember conversations from 20 years ago, searching for clues that might finally explain why 4 talented young musicians had vanished into the Amazon, victims of a war they never knew they were fighting. Daniel sat in silence for several minutes, his mind racing through memories he'd buried for 2 decades. The conference room felt impossibly small, the weight of revelation pressing down on him like the humid Amazon air outside. "Ben called me 3 days before they left," Daniel finally said, his voice distant with recollection. It was unusual because he never called that close to a tour. He was always too busy with final preparations. Miguel leaned forward, his pen poised over a notepad. What did he say? He was worried about something. Said their manager had made last-minute changes to their travel plans. Instead of flying commercial to São Paulo like they'd originally planned, they were taking a chartered flight directly to Manaus. Daniel paused, remembering the uncertainty in his brother's voice. Ben said it felt rushed, like someone wanted them to leave faster than scheduled. Rachel frowned. Who made those changes? The manager? Gary Hoffman. He'd been managing Iron Wolves for about 2 years at that point. Ben trusted him completely. Daniel's expression darkened. Maybe too completely. Miguel was already typing on his laptop. "We'll need to speak with Mr. Hoffman. Is he still managing bands?" Daniel shook his head. "Gary disappeared about 6 months after the crash. Just vanished. The band's record label said he'd suffered a nervous breakdown over losing his biggest act, but no one ever saw him again." The implications hung heavy in the air. Another piece of the puzzle that pointed to something far more orchestrated than a simple charter flight gone wrong. "There's something else," Rachel said, pulling out a manila folder. "When we were documenting the crash site, we found evidence of recent excavation work, professional grade. Someone with serious equipment had been there within the last 5 years, digging systematically through the wreckage." She spread out several photographs showing the crash site before and after the tree had fallen. The difference was stark. Where there should have been 20 years of jungle growth over untouched wreckage, there were clear signs of disturbance. Earth that had been moved and carefully replaced. Metal debris that had been sorted and repositioned. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for, Miguel observed. They left the personal items behind but removed anything that might have contained information about the flight's true purpose. Daniel studied the photos, noting the methodical nature of the excavation. "You think they found what they were looking for?" "We think they found some of it," Rachel replied, "but not everything. The camera was hidden too well, and there's something else." She pulled out a clear evidence bag containing what appeared to be a torn piece of fabric. "We found this wrapped around one of Ben's drumsticks. It's not from any clothing the band members were wearing." Miguel took the bag and held it up to the light. "The fabric is synthetic, military grade, not something you'd find in civilian clothing." "One of the kidnappers left it behind?" Daniel asked. "Possibly. Or," Rachel hesitated, "it might have come from someone who was trying to help them." The suggestion hung in the air like a lifeline. Daniel was afraid to grasp. "You think someone else was there? Someone who tried to rescue them?" Miguel's expression was carefully neutral. "We're exploring all possibilities. But Mr. Reeves, we need to be clear about something. Even if someone did try to help your brother and his friends, the likelihood that any of them survived beyond those first few weeks is—" "I know," Daniel interrupted, "but I need to understand what happened. All of it." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her expression troubled. "There's one more thing. The environmental group I work for has been tracking illegal logging in this region for years. The operation that exposed your brother's crash site, it wasn't random deforestation. Someone paid a lot of money to have that specific area cleared." "You're saying someone wanted the crash site found?" Daniel asked. "Or they wanted to make sure it stayed hidden," Miguel countered. "The timing is suspicious. 2 decades of jungle growth, and suddenly the exact tree covering the wreckage gets cut down?" Daniel felt a chill run down his spine despite the room's warmth. "Someone's been watching this site for 20 years. That's our theory," Rachel confirmed. The question is whether they're trying to cover up evidence or finally reveal it. As if summoned by their conversation, Miguel's phone buzzed with an urgent message. His face paled as he read it. "What is it?" Daniel asked. Miguel looked up, his expression grim. "We just received word from our field teams. They've found something else at the crash site. Something that changes everything we thought we knew about what happened to Iron Wolves." The room fell silent as Miguel gathered his papers with sudden urgency. After 20 years of questions, the Amazon was finally ready to give up all its secrets. But as Daniel would soon discover, some truths were more dangerous than the mysteries they replaced. The helicopter ride to the crash site took 45 minutes, the dense green canopy of the Amazon stretching endlessly below them like an ocean of leaves. Daniel pressed his face to the window, trying to imagine his brother somewhere in that vast wilderness, fighting for survival 20 years ago. Miguel sat across from him, speaking rapidly into his radio in Portuguese. The only words Daniel could understand were bodies and recent, which did nothing to calm his growing anxiety. "What exactly did your team find?" Daniel shouted over the helicopter's rotor noise. Miguel's expression was grim as he ended his radio conversation. "Graves, Mr. Reeves. Fresh graves." The helicopter touched down in a clearing that had obviously been created by heavy machinery. The stumps of recently felled trees dotted the landscape like broken teeth, and the air still carried the acrid smell of chainsaw exhaust mixed with the earthy richness of disturbed soil. Rachel was waiting for them as they disembarked, her face pale despite her Amazon tan. "Daniel, I need to prepare you for what we found. It's not what we expected." She led them along a narrow trail marked with yellow police tape, deeper into the jungle where the logging operation had stopped. The massive cecropia tree that had hidden the crash site for 20 years lay on its side, its trunk easily 10 feet in diameter. The exposed earth beneath told a story of careful excavation and equally careful concealment. "The crash site is here," Rachel said, pointing to twisted metal debris barely visible through 20 years of jungle growth. "But the graves are over there." About 50 yards away, Daniel could see a team of forensic specialists working under a portable canopy. As they approached, he could make out 4 distinct excavation sites, each marked with numbered stakes. "We've uncovered 4 bodies so far," Miguel explained, his voice professional but gentle. "All adult males, all showing signs of violence. But Mr. Reeves, these aren't 20-year-old remains." Daniel stopped walking. "What do you mean?" "The bodies have been in the ground for maybe 5 years, perhaps less. Someone killed these people recently and buried them here, at your brother's crash site." The implications hit Daniel like a physical blow. "You think these are the people who took my brother?" Rachel nodded slowly. "That's our working theory. Someone came back here years later and executed the men who kidnapped Iron Wolves." They reached the excavation site, where a forensic anthropologist was carefully photographing one of the graves. The body was clearly visible now, and Daniel could see the remnants of military-style clothing that matched what they'd seen in Ben's photos. "Dr. Santos," Miguel called to the anthropologist, "what can you tell us?" The older woman looked up from her work, her expression troubled. All 4 victims were shot execution-style, single bullets to the back of the head. Professional work. "And there's something else." She gestured to items laid out on a nearby table. "We found these with the bodies." Daniel stepped closer and felt his knees nearly buckle. On the table were personal items that clearly belonged to Iron Wolves. Jake Morrison's stage ring, Tyler Cross's leather bracelet, Matt Silva's wallet with his driver's license still visible through the plastic window, and Ben's watch, the Casio digital watch their father had given him for his 18th birthday. "They kept trophies," Rachel said quietly. "For 20 years these men kept souvenirs from your brother and his friends." Miguel picked up an evidence bag containing what appeared to be a military ID card. "Carlos Ruiz, former Venezuelan Army, dishonorably discharged in 1998 for drug trafficking." He looked at the other graves. "We're running identification on the others, but it appears we're dealing with a mercenary group that specialized in protecting drug shipments." "Someone hunted them down," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone came back and killed the people who murdered my brother." "That's what it looks like," Dr. Santos confirmed. "Whoever did this was methodical. professional. They executed these men and buried them at the exact site where Iron Wolves died. It wasn't random. Rachel was studying crime scene photos on her tablet. There's something ritualistic about this. The placement of the graves, the way the personal items were arranged with the bodies. This was about more than just revenge. Miguel's radio crackled to life, and Daniel heard excited voices speaking rapidly in Portuguese. Miguel's eyes widened as he listened. "What is it?" Daniel asked. Miguel looked at him with an expression that mixed hope with apprehension. "They've found something else, a structure hidden deeper in the jungle. Mr. Reeves, we think we may have found where your brother and his friends were held after they were taken from the crash site." As they prepared to venture deeper into the Amazon, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the final chapter of a story that had been 20 years in the making. Someone had spent decades planning this moment, and Daniel was beginning to suspect that his brother's death might not have been as final as everyone had believed. The hidden structure lay approximately 1 mile from the crash site, connected by what had once been a well-worn path but was now nearly invisible beneath 20 years of jungle growth. Daniel followed Miguel and Rachel through the oppressive humidity, sweat streaming down his face as insects buzzed relentlessly around them. "The satellite imagery shows the structure was built into a natural depression," Rachel explained as they pushed through a curtain of hanging vines. "From above, it would be completely invisible, perfect for hiding prisoners." When they finally emerged into a small clearing, Daniel found himself staring at what appeared to be the ruins of a crude but effective prison camp. Concrete block walls, partially collapsed but still standing, formed 3 separate cells around a central courtyard. Rusted metal bars covered window openings that were barely large enough for a person to look through. "Jesus," Daniel whispered, imagining his brother confined in this hellish place. Miguel was already photographing the scene, his camera flash illuminating details that made Daniel's stomach turn. Metal rings bolted into the concrete walls, obviously used for restraints. A crude drainage system that spoke of long-term occupation. And scratched into the concrete of the nearest cell wall, barely visible after 2 decades of weathering, were 4 sets of initials: JM, TC, MS, and BR. "They were here," Daniel said, reaching out to trace his brother's initials with trembling fingers. "They survived the kidnapping and were brought here." Rachel was examining the other cells, her expression growing more troubled with each discovery. This wasn't just a temporary holding facility. Someone built this place to keep people alive for extended periods. In the second cell, she found more scratches in the concrete. Numbers, arranged in what appeared to be a calendar system. "Look at this," she called to Daniel and Miguel. They were counting days. Daniel joined her, studying the marks. The system was methodical, organized into groups of 7 with larger marks separating what were obviously weeks. "How many?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. Rachel counted carefully. 37 weeks, almost 9 months. The number hit Daniel like a physical blow. His brother hadn't died quickly in the Amazon. He'd been held prisoner for 9 months, counting days on a concrete wall, hoping for rescue that never came. Miguel had moved to the 3rd cell, where he was photographing something scratched much more deeply into the concrete. "Mr. Reeves, you need to see this." Daniel approached reluctantly, unsure if he could handle another devastating revelation. But what he found wasn't just initials or calendar marks, it was a message, carved with desperate precision into the concrete wall. "Pilot set us up. Gary. Hoffman paid Mendoza. Tell Daniel we fought back. Ben Reeves, 2004. 2004, Daniel repeated, his voice barely audible. He was alive for almost a year. Rachel was examining the message more closely with a magnifying glass. The carving goes deep. This took him weeks to complete, maybe months. He wanted to make sure it would survive. Miguel was already on his radio, speaking rapidly to his team back in Manaus. When he finished, he turned to Daniel with a grim expression. "We're going to bring Gary Hoffman in for questioning. If he's still alive, we'll find him." "You said he disappeared," Daniel pointed out. "People don't just disappear completely," Miguel replied. "They leave traces, bank records, property transactions, medical records. If Hoffman is alive, he's been living under an assumed identity for 20 years. As they continued exploring the compound, they found evidence of its recent use. Cigarette butts that couldn't be more than a few years old, fresh scratches in the concrete that suggested recent excavation work, and in the central courtyard, a fire pit that still contained partially burned documents. Rachel carefully sifted through the ashes, finding fragments of text that were still legible. "These are financial records," she said, studying a partially burned page. "Bank transfers, account numbers. Someone was using this place as recently as last year." "The same people who executed the kidnappers?" Daniel asked. "Possibly, or someone else entirely." Miguel's expression was troubled. "Mr. Reeves, we may be dealing with multiple parties here. The original kidnappers, whoever killed them, and potentially other players we haven't identified yet." As the afternoon light began to fade through the jungle canopy, casting long shadows across the abandoned prison, Daniel felt the weight of 20 years pressing down on him. His brother had survived almost a year in this hellish place, long enough to carve a message that would eventually reach the person it was intended for. But Ben's message raised as many questions as it answered. If Gary Hoffman had orchestrated the band's kidnapping, who had killed the kidnappers? And why had they waited 15 years to exact their revenge? As they prepared to leave the compound, Daniel took one last look at his brother's carved message. Ben had fought back, just as he'd promised. Now it was Daniel's turn to continue that fight, no matter where it led him. Back in Manaus, Miguel's team worked through the night to trace Gary Hoffman's disappearance. Daniel sat in his hotel room, unable to sleep, staring at photographs of his brother's carved message. The words, "Tell Daniel we fought back," seemed to burn into his vision every time he closed his eyes. At 3 a.m., his phone rang. "Mr. Reeves, we found him." Miguel's voice was tense with excitement. "Gary Hoffman is alive. He's been living in Miami under the name Gerald Harris for the past 18 years. Daniel sat up in bed, his heart racing. "You're sure it's him?" "Fingerprints match. He's been running a small talent agency, nothing major, but legitimate on the surface. We've contacted Miami PD and the FBI. They're moving to arrest him now." "I want to be there when you question him," Daniel said. "That can be arranged. There's a flight to Miami leaving in 6 hours. But Mr. Reeves, there's something else you need to know about Hoffman." Daniel braced himself for another revelation. "What?" "He's been making large cash deposits into offshore accounts for the past 5 years. The timing coincides exactly with when we believe the kidnappers were executed." The implication hung in the air like a dark cloud. "You think Hoffman killed them? Or paid someone to do it?" "The deposits total nearly $2 million, Mr. Reeves. That's a lot of money for a small-time talent agent." 24 hours later, Daniel found himself in an FBI interrogation room in Miami, watching through one-way glass as Gary Hoffman sat across from federal agents. The man had aged considerably since Daniel last saw him, his hair now completely gray, his face lined with what appeared to be decades of stress. But his eyes were the same, sharp and calculating. "I don't know what you're talking about," Hoffman was saying to Agent Sarah Chen, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. "I've never heard of any Iron Wolves kidnapping. My clients died in a plane crash in 2003. Agent Chen slid a photograph across the table. It was Ben's carved message from the prison compound. "Your name is specifically mentioned here, Mr. Hoffman. Gary Hoffman paid Mendoza. Care to explain that?" Hoffman's composure cracked for just a moment, but it was enough. Daniel saw recognition flash across his face before the man regained control. "That could be anyone. Gary's a common name." "Not when it's accompanied by the name of the pilot you hired," Agent Chen countered. "Carlos Mendoza. We know about his drug trafficking history, Mr. Hoffman. We know about the modified flight plan, the last-minute charter change. We know you set those boys up." Hoffman leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from denial to calculation. "You can't prove any of this. That message could have been carved by anyone, at any time. What about the financial records?" Agent Chen pulled out a thick folder. $2 million in offshore payments over the past 5 years. Money that corresponds exactly to when the men who kidnapped Iron Wolves were executed. This time, Hoffman's reaction was unmistakable. His face went pale and his hands clenched into fists. "I don't know anything about any executions." "But you do know about the kidnapping," Agent Chen pressed. "Why, Mr. Hoffman? Why did you betray your own clients?" Hoffman was silent for a long moment, staring at the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't understand the kind of people I was dealing with. They would have killed me if I hadn't cooperated." "Who?" Agent Chen leaned forward. "Who threatened you?" "Drug cartel out of Colombia. I owed them money. A lot of money. Gambling debts that got out of hand." Hoffman's facade was crumbling now, 20 years of guilt and fear pouring out. "They said they'd kill me unless I helped. Them. The band was supposed to be carrying something on that flight, something valuable. When the plane went down, they blamed me for the loss." Daniel felt sick. His brother and his friends had been sacrificed to pay Gary Hoffman's gambling debts. "What happened to them?" Agent Chen asked. "The band members. We know they survived the crash." Hoffman's hands were shaking violently now. "I don't know. I swear I don't know. After the plane went down, the cartel cut contact with me. I thought they were dead. I thought it was over." "But it wasn't over," Agent Chen said. 5 years ago, something changed. You started making payments again." "Why?" Hoffman looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "Because someone started hunting the cartel members. One by one they were disappearing. The ones who took the band, the ones who knew what really happened. And then I got a message." "What kind of message?" "A photo of the prison compound where they held the band, and a note that said if I didn't pay, I'd be next." Agent Chen exchanged glances with her partner. "Who sent the message?" Hoffman shook his head desperately. "I don't know. The payments were sent to an anonymous account. But whoever it was, they knew everything. They knew about my involvement. They knew about the cartel. They knew where the band had been held." In the observation room, Daniel felt his world spinning. Someone had been systematically hunting down his brother's killers for years. Someone who knew the truth about what had happened to Iron Wolves. But who? And why had they waited so long to act? As the interrogation continued, one thing became clear. Gary Hoffman was as much a victim as he was a perpetrator. But somewhere out there was someone else. Someone who had spent 20 years planning the perfect revenge for 4 young musicians who had died far from home. Daniel was beginning to realize that the most dangerous part of this story was yet to come. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. As Daniel sat in the FBI field office, trying to process everything he'd learned about Gary Hoffman's betrayal, Agent Chen received an urgent call from her digital forensics team. "We've traced the anonymous payments," she announced, hanging up the phone. "The account receiving Hoffman's money belongs to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. But here's the interesting part. The company was established in 2004, just months after your brother carved that message." Daniel looked up sharply. 2004? That's when Ben was still alive." "Exactly. Someone has been planning this for 20 years, Mr. Reeves. This wasn't a spontaneous revenge scheme. This was carefully orchestrated from the very beginning." Agent Chen's partner, Agent Rodriguez, entered the room carrying a laptop. "We've got more. The shell company has been making payments to a private investigation firm in São Paulo, and that firm has been conducting surveillance on drug cartel members throughout South America for the past 15 years. Surveillance that led to their executions," Agent Chen added grimly. Daniel's mind was racing. "Someone hired private investigators to track down my brother's killers. But who? Who would have had the resources and the motivation to do that?" The answer came from Miguel, who had been working the case from the Brazilian side. His video call appeared on Agent Chen's laptop, his face grim with new revelations. "We've identified the private investigation firm," Miguel announced. "Jaguar Security Solutions, run by a former Brazilian military officer named Captain Eduardo Santos. But here's what's interesting. Santos died in a car accident 3 years ago. Since then, the company has been run by his daughter." "What's her name?" Daniel asked, though something deep in his gut already knew the answer would change everything. "Sophia Santos. But Mr. Reeves, you might know her by a different name." Miguel paused, his expression troubled. "We believe she's been operating under multiple identities for years, including the name Rachel Stone." The room fell silent as the implications hit Daniel like a physical blow. Rachel, the environmental activist who had supposedly discovered his brother's crash site by accident, had been orchestrating this entire revelation from the beginning. Agent Chen was already on her phone, calling her team in Brazil. "Where is she now?" "That's the problem," Miguel replied. "She disappeared from Manaus yesterday, right after we left for the prison compound. Hotel room cleared out, rental car returned, no trace." Daniel felt betrayed and confused, but also strangely hopeful. If Rachel, or Sophia, has been hunting these people for 20 years, maybe she knows something about what really happened to my brother. Maybe she knows if any of them survived. Agent Rodriguez was typing rapidly on his laptop. "I'm running facial recognition on the photos we have of Rachel Stone. If she's been using multiple identities, we might be able to track her movements." "There's something else," Miguel added. "We found surveillance equipment at the prison compound, high-tech stuff that's been recording activity there for years. If Sofia Santos has been watching that site, she would have known exactly when someone came to excavate the graves. She led us there on purpose," Daniel realized. The environmental survey, the logging operation, all of it was designed to expose the crash site at exactly the right time. Agent Chen nodded grimly. "The question is, what's her endgame? She spent 20 years and millions of dollars hunting down your brother's killers. She's exposed Gary Hoffman, led us to the evidence, revealed the truth about what happened. What does she want now?" The answer came in the form of a message that appeared on Agent Rodriguez's laptop screen. An encrypted email that had just been sent to the FBI's Miami field office. "Meet me where it all began. Come alone, or the truth dies with me. Daniel knows where to find his brother. Sophia." Daniel stared at the message, his heart pounding. After 20 years of questions, Sophia Santos was offering him the final answers. But as Agent Chen immediately made clear, those answers would come at a price that might cost Daniel his life. Against every protocol and the FBI's explicit orders, Daniel found himself on a helicopter flying back into the Amazon at dawn. Agent Chen had tried to stop him, threatening arrest if he left Miami, but Daniel knew this was his only chance to learn the truth about his brother's fate. "Meet me where it all began," Sophia's message had said. Daniel knew she meant the crash site, the place where Iron Wolf's charter plane had gone down 20 years ago and changed the trajectory of so many lives. The pilot, a local named Carlos, who had no idea about the danger they were flying into, set the helicopter down in the same clearing where Daniel had landed just days before. The morning mist clung to the jungle canopy, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made everything feel like a dream. Sophia was waiting for him. She stood near the fallen cecropia tree, no longer the helpful environmental activist Rachel Stone, but someone entirely different. Her posture was military straight. Her clothes were tactical gear, and a sidearm was visible on her hip. But it was her eyes that struck Daniel most, eyes that held 20 years of purpose and pain. "Hello, Daniel," she said as he approached. Her accent was different now, distinctly Brazilian, no longer the American inflection she'd used as Rachel. "I've been waiting a long time to have this conversation." "Why?" Daniel asked, stopping about 10 feet away from her. "Why the deception? Why not just tell me the truth from the beginning?" Sophia smiled sadly. "Because you wouldn't have believed me. Because the truth is so much worse than you imagine." She gestured toward the crash site. "Your brother didn't just die here, Daniel. He escaped." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. "What?" "Ben survived the prison camp. He escaped in late 2004, along with Jake Morrison. The other two, Tyler and Matt, they died in captivity. But Ben and Jake made it out." Daniel's legs felt weak. "That's impossible. If they escaped, why didn't they come home? Why didn't Ben contact me?" Sophia's expression darkened. "Because they couldn't. The cartel had put prices on their heads, and Gary Hoffman had given them detailed information about the band members' families. If Ben had returned to Portland, you would have been killed within days." She reached into her tactical vest and pulled out a worn photograph. Even from a distance, Daniel could see it showed two emaciated men standing in front of a small wooden structure. One of them was unmistakably his brother, older and scarred but very much alive. This was taken in 2005, in a remote village about 200 miles from here. My father was the first person to make contact with them after they escaped. They'd been living with indigenous people, recovering from their ordeal. Daniel reached for the photograph with trembling hands. Ben looked nothing like the young drummer who had left for South America in 2003. His face was gaunt, marked by scars, his hair longer and streaked with premature gray. But his eyes were the same, and he was smiling at whoever was taking the picture. "Where is he now?" Daniel whispered. Sophia's expression became unreadable. "That depends on you, Daniel. You see, Ben and Jake have been living under assumed identities for almost 20 years. They've built new lives, started families. They're safe, but they can never be Ben Reeves and Jake Morrison again." "I don't understand." "My father promised them that he would eliminate the threat against their families. It's taken 20 years, but we've finally tracked down and neutralized everyone who knew their true identities. Everyone except Gary Hoffman." Daniel looked up from the photograph. "Hoffman's in FBI custody now, which means the threat is finally over," Sophia said. "For the first time in 20 years, your brother can contact his family safely. But Daniel, you have to understand, he's not the same person you remember. 20 years of hiding, of living in fear, it changes a person." She pulled out a satellite phone and held it toward him. "He's waiting for your call." Daniel stared at the phone, his entire world reshaping itself around this impossible revelation. His brother was alive. After 20 years of grief and unanswered questions, Ben was alive and waiting to hear his voice. But as Daniel reached for the phone, Sophia's expression shifted to one of warning. "Before you make that call, you need to know something else. The reason I brought you here, alone. This conversation is being monitored by people who still want your brother dead." Daniel froze, the satellite phone halfway to his ear. "What do you mean, monitored?" Sophia's hand moved to her sidearm as her eyes scanned the jungle around them. "Gary Hoffman wasn't working alone, Daniel. The Colombian cartel he owed money to, they were just middlemen. There's a larger organization involved, one that's been using the Amazon drug routes for decades." "Who?" "International syndicate with connections in military, government, and private security. They've been watching this case for 20 years, waiting for Ben and Jake to surface." Sophia's voice was tense, professional. "My father spent his last 3 years tracking them down. It's what got him killed." Daniel's blood ran cold. "The car accident?" "No accident. They discovered his investigation and eliminated him, but not before he passed everything to me." She gestured toward the dense jungle. "They know you're here. Daniel, they've been tracking you since you left Miami." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching helicopters cut through the morning air. Multiple aircraft, moving fast and low over the canopy. "How many?" Daniel asked, his mouth dry with fear. Sophia was already moving, grabbing Daniel's arm and pulling him toward the crashed plane's wreckage. "Too many. We need cover." They reached the twisted metal remains of Iron Wolf's charter plane, just as the first helicopter appeared over the treetops. It was black, unmarked, and bristling with armed men rappelling down ropes before it had even fully stopped. "Who are they?" Daniel shouted over the rotor noise. "Private military contractors," Sophia replied, checking her weapon. "The syndicate's cleanup crew. They're here to eliminate the last witnesses to what happened 20 years ago." Daniel crouched behind a piece of wing debris, his heart pounding. "That includes me. That includes both of us." The second helicopter landed in the clearing, disgorging more armed men who immediately began spreading out in a coordinated sweep pattern. These weren't random thugs, Daniel realized. They were professionals, moving with military precision through the jungle terrain. Sophia handed Daniel a small device that looked like a modified radio. "Emergency beacon. If something happens to me, activate it. My team will extract you." "Your team?" "What did you think, Daniel? That I've been hunting these people alone for 20 years? Sophia's smile was grim. "My father left me more than just information. He left me an organization." The crack of gunfire erupted from the jungle as Sophia's hidden team engaged the incoming mercenaries. Daniel could hear the sharp reports of assault rifles mixing with the deeper boom of sniper fire from concealed positions. "Ben's safe," Sophia said, staying low as bullets whistled overhead. Whatever happens here, he's protected. But Daniel, I need you to know something. The phone call you were about to make, it wasn't just to your brother. What do you mean? Jake, Morrison has been working with us for 5 years. He's the one who's been feeding us information about the syndicate's operations. This whole thing, bringing you here, exposing the truth, it was his plan. Daniel stared at her in shock. Jake's been fighting them? Your brother wanted to come home, but Jake convinced him to stay hidden, said it was too dangerous. But Jake, he wanted revenge. He spent 15 years infiltrating their organization, working his way up, gaining their trust. The gunfire was getting closer now, and Daniel could see muzzle flashes through the jungle foliage. Sophia's team was outnumbered, but fighting with the advantage of prepared positions. There's something else, Sophia said, checking her ammunition. The reason Jake insisted on this meeting, on exposing everything now. The syndicate is planning something big, something that would make the Iron Wolves kidnapping look like a minor incident. What? Sophia looked at him with eyes that held the weight of 20 years of secrets. They're planning to crash another plane, Daniel. A commercial flight with 300 passengers aboard. And unless we stop them in the next 24 hours, your brother's story is going to become just one tragedy among hundreds. As the sound of approaching boots crashed through the underbrush around them, Daniel realized that his search for the truth about Iron Wolves had led him into the middle of something far larger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The firefight lasted 18 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the last gunshot echoed through the Amazon canopy and smoke began clearing from the jungle floor, Daniel found himself alive, but forever changed by what he'd witnessed. Sophia's team had prevailed, their superior knowledge of the terrain, overcoming the mercenaries' advanced equipment. 3 hours later, Daniel sat in a secure compound 200 miles from the crash site, staring at a video screen that showed a face he hadn't seen in 20 years. Ben looked older, weathered by 2 decades of exile, but his smile was exactly as Daniel remembered. "Hello, brother," Ben said, his voice carrying the weight of all those lost years. "I've missed you more than you can imagine." Daniel's hands shook as he gripped the secure phone. "Ben, I thought you were dead. I grieved for you for 20 years. I know, and I'm sorry for that pain. But Daniel, if I had contacted you, if I had tried to come home, they would have killed you, Mom, Dad, everyone we cared about." Ben's eyes filled with tears. "I couldn't risk your lives for my freedom." Jake Morrison appeared on the screen beside Ben, looking nothing like the rock star Daniel remembered. His face was harder now, marked by scars, and the kind of resolve that comes from years of planning revenge. "Daniel, what your brother isn't telling you is that he saved hundreds of lives by staying hidden," Jake said. "The intelligence I gathered over the past 5 years, it prevented 3 major terrorist attacks. The syndicate we've been fighting, they don't just run drugs. They're arms dealers, human traffickers, and worse." Sophia entered the room carrying a laptop. The commercial flight they were planning to target was scheduled to leave São Paulo tomorrow morning, bound for Miami. 312 passengers, including 47 children. "Was?" Daniel asked. "Brazilian authorities just arrested the pilot and confiscated the aircraft. The explosive devices hidden in the cargo hold have been disarmed." Sophia's expression was one of grim satisfaction. Jake's intelligence saved those lives. Over the next hour, the full scope of the operation became clear. Ben and Jake's supposed deaths had been the perfect cover for a decades-long investigation that had dismantled one of South America's most dangerous criminal organizations. The pain Daniel had carried for 20 years had been the price of hundreds of innocent lives saved. "What happens now?" Daniel asked as the video call continued. "Can you come home?" Ben and Jake exchanged glances before Ben answered. "The syndicate's leaders are dead or in custody. The immediate threat is over. But Daniel, we're not the same people we were in 2003. We have families here, lives we've built. Home isn't Portland anymore." "But you're alive," Daniel said, tears streaming down his face. "After 20 years of wondering, of hoping, you're alive." "We're alive," Ben confirmed. "And thanks to Sophia and her father's sacrifice, we're finally free to live without fear." 6 months later, Daniel stood in a small church in São Paulo, watching his brother walk his daughter down the aisle. Ben had indeed built a new life, complete with a Brazilian wife and 2 children who had never known their father was once a drummer in a rock band called Iron Wolves. Jake stood beside Daniel as Ben's best man, his face peaceful in a way Daniel had never seen during their music days. After the ceremony, as they sat together watching the celebration, Jake spoke quietly about the cost of their survival. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd just been a band," Jake said. "If we'd never gotten on that plane, never gotten mixed up with Gary Hoffman's debts." Daniel considered this. "You'd probably be playing small venues and working day jobs. Instead, you saved hundreds of lives and brought down an international criminal organization. Was it worth it?" Jake asked. Daniel looked at his brother dancing with his daughter, surrounded by the family he'd built in exile, finally free to live openly after 20 years of hiding. "Ask me in another 20 years, Daniel said. "But right now, seeing Ben happy and alive, I think it was worth everything." As the Brazilian sun set over the celebration, Daniel finally understood that some stories don't end with people coming home. Sometimes they end with people finally being free to stay where they belong. The Iron Wolves had flown into the Amazon as naive young musicians chasing their dreams. They had emerged as men who understood that sometimes the greatest victories require the greatest sacrifices, and that the most important battles are fought not for fame or fortune, but for the lives of people you'll never meet. Ben Reeves was finally home. It just wasn't the home Daniel had expected.